Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Father David Cregan, and I teach in the theater department and in the English department. We're going to have really a discussion rather than a panel today. But first I'm going to allow the people who are gathered with me on the stage here to introduce themselves. My own research interest, my doctoral work and my publishing since the time that I've been out of graduate school has been in the area of gender studies. In particular, my focus is the representation of masculinity studies, gay and lesbian and transgender theories as well.
My name is Sally Scholes. I'm a professor in philosophy, and I am also a faculty and resident at the Center for Peace and Justice with my lovely colleagues. And my research in philosophy is in social and political philosophy and feminist theory. So I dabble in a lot of different feminist theories. I've also written on more applied issues pertaining to women, such as violence against women, domestic violence, and war rape.
I'm Jean Lutes, and I'm an associate professor in the English department where I specialize in modern American fiction. I'm a feminist literary critic, and I'm especially interested in women writers of the late 19th and early 20th century. I've written also about feminist theory and how feminist theory impacts pedagogy, so how we teach. That's another one of my interests. So,
my name is Nicole L Request. I'm in the psychology department. My teaching and research is broadly in the areas of psychology of women and gender development. So a lot of my research looks at emotion and gender roles, self-stereotyping, and how they relate to things like interest and achievement in math and science.
Okay. I think that maybe it might be interesting as well to say like how this is the first year that I've been on the Gender and Women's Studies Steering Committee. So maybe if you kind of tell them how long you've been involved in it, that might be kind of
sure. So I am not on the Gender and Studies Steering Committee, but I was for a lot of years,
okay.
and then just stepped off for other committee things. I don't know how long I was on it. I've been here 16 years, and I was probably on it for 10. So.
and I guess I've been on the steering committee since I came here, which was 7 years ago now. So, and I joined because it was the most compelling committee work I could possibly do, pretty much. So
That was my answer. So this is my 4th year at Villanova, and I guess my second year on Gender and Women's Studies. And I guess I was involved in the Women's Studies program where I did my doctoral work at the University of Wisconsin, and always assumed that at some point I would be able to connect with the other people on campus who cared about gender and women. So.
I kind of fought to get onto the committee rather than waiting for an invitation. I sort of started harassing Sherry Bowen about 4 years ago about getting involved in gender and women's. It was women's studies at the time, and I wanted to be involved in women's studies because I always felt when I was working on my master's, and of course then when I went into my PhD work, that this was the most interesting work that was happening in sort of academia because of how controversial it often is. And I think in a lot of ways also because what it incites in people is not just intellectual curiosity, but it also sort of incites like personal feelings about the way that the world is structured, about our own experiences, and about the way that things either should be or could be. So there's a lot of, I think, aspiration as well as a little bit of anarchy and a little bit of disruption within gender and women's studies that I love. When I first was invited to join, the very first activity that I participated in was a discussion in the library last year about the name change, because for those of you that don't know the history of it, it was women's studies for 20 years? Is it
a long time? I think it was, 84?
84, yeah. So it was women's studies until just about a year ago, right, when the name change came to include gender and women's studies as a way of breaking open the program to move into, like, you know, men's issues, gay and lesbian and transgendered issues as well. So is that pretty accurate? Is that an accurate enough assessment? So the first thing that I participated in was that discussion about the name change, and I really look forward to it because I love being antagonistic in those kind of intellectual environments and throwing things out there that I may not feel really passionate about, but that instead help people think about things and maybe challenge the way that people think about things, and perhaps invite people to think about things in a different way by listening to both the experience and the research and intellectual abilities of other people. So I was asked to chair the Activism panel, and we began our work trying to plan activities for what kind of activism might be appropriate for gender and women's studies. And Dr. Barbara Wall, the Vice President for Mission Effectiveness, came into the first large steering committee meeting that I was at and gave an impassioned speech about the significance of gender and women's studies, and asking the committee to consider moving into a form of activism that would tie into, say, the larger mission of the university, which is service-oriented. So when we began to sit down as a subcommittee to talk about activism, the question of service came up. And this is where our email conversation about the way service and activism were kind of not conflating with each other, but intersecting with each other and in some ways colliding with each other. And so it seemed like, sort of like a given that with this wonderful invitation from Barbara to consider becoming more active in a service orientation, that we might take on a project. And we began to talk about what possible projects we would take on that would be focused on gender and women's studies. But I had an inkling inside of me that I felt a little bit was a question that was beginning to bubble up. Because like I said, I like controversy and I like to cause problems. So one of the questions that I brought up was, that I wanted to bring up, was brought to me by somebody else on the committee to say, is service what gender and women's studies should actually be doing? And I'm saying service because I'm framing service within the context of the way that Villanova really looks at service, like going into the inner city, or going to India or Cambodia, or getting involved in tutoring and so on and so forth. Should service be what is the appropriate thing for gender and women's studies in relationship to the question of what is activism for the committee? And it ended up being, I wouldn't say controversial, but we certainly had long conversations that they went longer than we wanted them to, because we're all busy people, and they were kind of divided. Because some people felt adamantly that we needed to get out there and get involved in, say, for instance, something like a community organization that might be helping women who are trying to enter into the workplace for the first time, get their lives in order in such a way to be able to, get out there and market themselves within the world. Or we were given an invitation by Noreen Cameron to perhaps get involved in the Road School, which is a Philadelphia school, an inner city Philadelphia school that's oriented towards young women and towards helping young women to advance themselves intellectually and in the world. My inkling began to be that I was wondering why we needed to do that. And that came out of, I think, the notion that oftentimes when you're working in gender studies, at least when you're working in masculinity and you're working in gay, lesbian, and transgender theory, you are almost automatically what has been termed an academic outlaw. Like you're almost living on the fringes of the academy, the intellectual and teaching aspects of university life and so on and so forth. And so I kind of felt to myself like, I don't know that I need to go into the inner city and help people as a form of activism or even as a form of service, because my service is the service that I bring into my classroom when I stand in front of my classroom and I wear a collar or I wear a habit and I talk about something like gay and lesbian issues, which is supposed to be something that perhaps we're not supposed to look too favorably upon. So I consider myself to be not only an academic outlaw in my writing and my publishing, but slightly to be living in that kind of activist, service-oriented mode in my teaching in this elite, predominantly white, straight institution. So that's where my point of view came from. And then other things began to emerge where we started to like buck heads about that. So instead of monopolizing the conversation like I'm doing, which I guess like all teachers have tendencies to do, I was like, what am I going to talk about, as if I've ever had to worry about that before. What I'd like to do is make this more of a discussion, really, than a panel talk. So to open it up to your comments and questions as quickly as you feel inspired to get involved. But one of the things that I asked the people who agreed to be on the panel today to do was to think about what service was, or perhaps what activism was in their view, in relationship to the Gender and Women's Studies Steering Committee and the program in general. So I don't know if you had a chance to.
Do you want to go?
Sure. I guess, first of all, I would say that the tension between activism and what you do in the classroom has always existed from the beginning of women's studies, before it was gender and women's studies, not just at Villanova, but the beginning of women's studies as an academic discipline. It was always a weird mishmash of women who were agitating to improve conditions of women, every woman, not just in schools, and then people who are interested in studying women as an academic pursuit. So women's studies as a discipline, as an interdisciplinary field of study, has always had this tension between, once feminism becomes academic, is it still really feminism? Mm-hmm. Is it still really doing something? And there's also a tension between what I call advocacy and what I call direct action. And what David just described is advocacy. Right? What he does in his classroom, what he talks about, that's advocacy. Direct action would be, an example of direct action could be something like a sit-in or organizing a strike, some kind of protest. It could also be, for instance, if I'm, say, a woman faculty member and I think that we should have daycare on campus, one way of trying to agitate for that would be to engage in professionalized activism and have meetings, write letters, form new committees, submit task force reports, agitate that way.
Talk to people in the parking lot.
Talk to people in the parking lot. Or if I wanted to do direct action for that, I could say, talk to all the other women I know on campus who have small children who would like daycare on campus, and organize a cooperative. Academics, however, and actually just do it, right? Find a way and just make it happen. And traditionally in academia, the way that most significant change occurs on campuses, if we're going to talk about that, as opposed to, say, the service in Cambodia or the service in Philadelphia, in the streets of Philadelphia, the way that most change happens is if people actually do it directly. Academics are more comfortable with, I am more comfortable with advocacy than I am with, say, organizing the daycare co-op. But I'm noting that as a tension between what it means when we are in the academy and we're saying we care about women, and gender and women's studies is a discipline that is supposed to improve the condition of women around the globe, help us understand it and improve it. How much are we going to actually do? And I, of course, believe that learning is doing. But activism forces us to consider that in a different way. And I would say that for me, activism is energetic action that is inspired by a commitment to make change. And I don't think activism ever occurs without personal sacrifice and without personal risk-taking. And I don't think that college is always the place where students are most encouraged to do those two things, particularly sacrifice and risk-taking without the promise of some kind of payoff at the end. The line in the resume, the recommendation. So activism and academia are always going to be an uncomfortable fit, even though I think they actually really need each other.
I just want to add, you were talking about whether it was still feminism, if it was part of academia, and the challenge that I often face from my colleagues in psychology is it still psychology if feminism is involved? Because suddenly I lose my scientific legitimacy if I start talking about activism. And the truth is, the whole reason that I became a psychologist was because I wanted to be an activist, but wanted to be able to provide for my family. And so I have always framed not just the teaching as sort of a consciousness-raising thing, an advocacy, and saying, okay, well, I want my students to have an appreciation for women's experiences and to understand how their own experiences fit into the big picture, to demystify those experiences and say, guess what, childhood sexual abuse, it's not about the victim, it's about the culture that we live in. And you know, that form of education to me has always been activism. And you know, at the end of every semester, with each student who comes by and tells me thank you for making me see something that I didn't see before, men and women, that you know, that belief that it's activism has been confirmed. But then on the science side, I have always had this conflict, which is, isn't science supposed to be objective? And well, that's a whole other debate, whether anything is objective. But the idea that one could not have as guiding principles within a theoretical perspective in science that that males and females are equal. Why that should be a controversial thing is still baffling to me. That would suddenly, you know, that kind of perspective would in any way diminish the scientific integrity of what I do. It doesn't make sense. So my approach with my science has always been, okay, well, there are areas of inquiry, there are phenomena that relate to injustices based on gender all around the world, whether it's how gender role stereotypes prevent girls from taking advanced math, which ultimately mean they don't get really good jobs and contribute to a pay gap, which contribute to their economic dependency on men, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I say, okay, let's use science as a tool to examine those stereotypes, see if they're rooted in any real fact, and if they're not, to get that word out so that people start questioning their stereotypes and say, okay, I'm going to think differently about myself, I'm going to think differently about girls and boys, men and women generally. So I think there is a way within each discipline, I suspect, to integrate that guiding principle of activism, not just the consciousness raising, but also affecting some change. Maybe it's not the traditional form of activism, but still affecting change by drawing on the strengths that each of us has. I'm not good at organizing much of anything. Certainly not any sort of political action in the very traditional sense of activism. But I feel like I have strengths in psychology that I can use as an activist, ultimately.
Great. So I actually am good at organizing political things. But I also think that when we think about activism, there are pedagogical issues, which I think, David, you spoke to very well, and there are research issues. In both of those, you can approach activism from different angles. So I completely agree with you that the teaching about transgender issues here at this university is an activist act. Can you say that? And doing the research that you do, Nicole, and that you do, Jean, too, with feminist literary criticism, are also activist acts coming from our individual strengths. And I think that the philosophy that I write is as well. But I also think that when you take the title or the claim or when you call yourself a feminist, you join a collective movement. It's a movement it's a solidarity movement. You are united with others. And it's a political act. And so doing women's studies is itself a political act on campus. And that puts us into relation with others, whether we recognize those relations or not. And so then the challenge becomes, in addressing activism in my classes, is this the correct pedagogy for this class, right? Is this how I want to enact activism in this class, through service or learning, through advocacy, through whatever it is? And I think they have to match. I think that you have a responsibility as a pedagogue and you have a responsibility as a feminist to figure out ways that they do match. The other thing, though, is that in being political, I think, or I would argue, that women's studies refuses to accept that there is a distinction between academics and the real world, or academics and advocacy. I think in some sense, in being a feminist, making that political stance, I am claiming that what I do in the classroom is political. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm coming to evangelize and to make y'all feminists, though I will if you want. But, no, I'll try. But it does mean that I am consciously aware. So that when I, for instance, there's a phrase I often teach in my class, the rule of thumb. You've heard this expression, just as rule of thumb? And so I always talk about this rule of thumb in my class. Some of you, do you remember what the rule of thumb is? Yeah? Do you remember? Maybe we didn't in your class. Oh, I missed a class. Okay, so anyway, the rule of thumb, there are a lot of different, you get different theories about the etymology or the origins of this expression. But one source is that it comes from English common law, and it is based on the rule. Do you remember now? What is it?
Oh, no.
That a man could beat his wife. Sorry, I put you totally on the spot. I'm sorry. That a man could beat his wife with a switch no greater than the thickness of his thumb. Right? This is the rule of thumb. Okay, so when I teach that, I view that as activism. Okay? But I'm also consciously aware that I'm not teaching university students. I'm teaching people who go out into the world, who are in the world. It's not that we have a university and a world. We've got an institution in the world, and we are part of it. And so claiming of being a feminist and embracing the fact that that is a political act means that I am acting in the world. So.
It reminds me of when I was in graduate school, I had approached my advisor because I was feeling like I wasn't engaged enough in that real world with sitting at my computer and analyzing data and writing papers. And she said, you know what? I thought that once. And I realized that my students are people who are going to go out and run businesses and make hiring decisions. They're people who are going to make policy decisions about family leave or daycare in the workplace, and making sure that they have enough information to make educated decisions about things that affect women's lives. That's important, and the knowledge that they get in my classroom, if I give them the right knowledge that they need to make those choices, down the line, it's affecting some change.
One of the most, sorry.
No,
please,
I was going to say,
please.
and if we see ourselves as working collectively, then we each bring our gifts, right? So you teach and you build awareness.
Right.
We all
but,
teach.
But if I would say, I agree with everything you guys are saying, but I would also say that as a collective group of feminists on campus, we also are not, we have academic culture, if we want to just look at here, or we want to think about what we do right here. It has not been transformed by feminism in the way that it could have been or needs to be, and the world has not. So thinking more about how we can do that, things like, for instance, making sure that young women have access to birth control. Things like making sure that my gay and lesbian colleagues have benefits, domestic partner benefits. They have benefits for their partners, things like that. So I agree that that we always help with our teaching, but I do think that gender and women's studies also asks us to consider some of the other concrete effects that make us uncomfortable, that are about the lived realities of our students and people's lives. So.
See, that's where I come from too, from a fundamental place. And this is like when I first started teaching at Villanova, and I'd been studying in Europe, and I came back to a phenomena that literally made I sucked my breath in class. A student, regardless of their gender, said to me, oh, no, I'm not interested in feminism. They're all so angry and they hate men. And I went, oh, what happened? What happened between the 80s and the 90s when I was in college, and when you guys got this notion that feminism is about hating men and about being angry? Something has gone terribly wrong in that perception. I don't know if anyone wants to kind of engage in that kind of debate, but my perception of the demographic that we deal with is that they don't know what it means to be a feminist, and that in fact they have no interest in being feminists because they think feminists are angry and hate men.
First day lecture.
Yeah, there's some nodding head. Yeah, Carol.
I think that just being a teacher who's a feminist conveys to people who think perhaps that all feminists are angry and hate men.
Yeah.
In undermines that perception, because students see you, you are their faculty members, you act professionally, you do not wave your bras or burn them, which, by the way, never happened. That was a rumor. And you treat your male colleagues with respect as they treat you. So even, I think, beyond being an active advocate for feminism, just being a strong woman and being that role model can help to, poor man, sorry, can help to undermine the idea that anyone who espouses feminism is, is an angry man-hater.
See, my idea is that when people get these perceptions, they lock into what they perceive to be an experience, which simultaneously ignores a reality that is so much deeper than their experience. And frankly, you guys are part of like the reality television, like everything's real, and like, sometimes I walk around wondering whether people think they're on reality television shows, like when they're in the supermarket. And as a result of that, the value of your experience, in my opinion as a teacher, has been elevated too high. You were told that you were special at some point in your education. We pulled back grading to help with self-esteem. And so everything's about how you feel about something. And as a teacher, I feel like that's a shocking misrepresentation of what it means to be a human being. Because no one is really special. We're all like a kind of a degree above or below or within this like spectrum of just about ordinary. And the reality is that your experience does not dictate the reality of the way that everything else is in the world. So when you come into my classroom and you say to me that you don't want to be a feminist because feminists are angry, I think to myself like, wow, this person has a lot of learning to do. And they consider themselves to be intelligent, but that's a remarkably unintelligent thing to say. And so, of course, I say that in my mind, and I go, great answer. And I think about week 14 rather than week 1. And that's where I think of myself as like not just throwing ideas around, but actually concretely like taking a bucket of water and throwing it on a human person to help like kind of shake off like what your conceptions are. I teach theater. Because I teach theater in the classroom doesn't mean that I'm not a practitioner. The people who I teach will go out and be practitioners, but inevitably what I do is part of the practice of theater. And I think that what we do is part of the practice of the continuum of what activism is, so that some people do want to go out and hold placards, but others of us want to tell people like why they should be angry or motivated.
Well, unfortunately, I think this is going to take the breath out of you again. I teach over at the law school, and I don't teach any gender and women's studies courses, but I've been on the steering committee for a number of years, and it's been a fabulous experience. For a number of years, we had a feminist legal theory course, and the way many law school courses are taught is there's an exam at the end of the semester or maybe a paper. The professor who used to teach the course instead had students do interim projects and short papers or media presentations. There are a whole variety of things to present different perspectives, but went to teach somewhere else. And we finally have a new professor who hopefully you will all get to hear speak sometime this year, who is one of her specialties is gender and feminist legal theory. And she's teaching feminist legal theory this semester, and there are men and women in the course, and there have actually been other students who said, I would take the course, but I'm concerned about having the word feminist on my transcript. So I hear the breath on the way. So this is law school. This is not undergrad. So I think that what Father Cregan says about stereotypes and where we get these images is really important to examine, and whether it comes from discussions in your family or discussions from a different generation, it's a really important thing to examine because there's really interesting stuff out there. And in terms of physical activism, sort of, whether it's coming from a gender perspective or not, I would encourage you all as undergrads or grad students or faculty that there's so much opportunity, and I know here at Villanova with Peace and Justice and elsewhere, there's so much incredible opportunity to go out and do things to change the world, and whatever the perspective is, or to help it heal. And whatever perspective you're coming from, whether it's gender or religious or whatever, seize these opportunities. You may not have the opportunity in your life after college, or you might choose to make it your life, or you may choose to do it through teaching, or a combination of teaching and rallying activism, or whatever you want to call it.
And in your child rearing.
Non-pedagogical, right, and how you raise your kids too.
And to be able to, for me, to be able to conflate these notions of marginalization and diversity with issues of Christianity and Jesus Christ. Like my interest in marginalization, my interest in diversity comes from the root of what is the most important thing in my life, and that is my faith. And so when I look out at the world through what I want to do research in, I try to look out at the world through the eyes of what Christ saw when he looked out in the world. And what he saw was the edges. Who's standing on the edge? Who thinks they're not part of the story? Who is everybody else telling that they're not part of the story? And what did he do? For me, he went out and he took them by the hand and he pulled them into the center and said, like, this is about you as well. So I put myself at risk when I step out to do things. And that's, I think, why I feel like really passionately about this stuff, is because when I come in and I'm wearing my habit or a collar and I'm advocating for diversity in front of a group of students who would like to consider themselves to be Christians, but who are also exclusive about who is in the in and who's on the out, I feel like I'm doing like my academic work, my spiritual work, my life work, all at the same time.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And there's a way, too, though, that we have to be careful about thinking of the in and out in terms of the institution and anyone not part of the institution. And so I would, and maybe this was, well, I hope it's seen as echoing what Jean said earlier, but that we do have an obligation to our fellow travelers who are on the front lines advocating for social change in that way that's more sacrificial, as you said, that really carries a lot of political risk and whatnot. And then the other thing that I wanted to say too is that there have been a lot of studies, at least in philosophy there have been a number, that look at why young people today don't want to take the F word, as they say, right? Don't want to take the name of feminist. And a lot of it is because they've reified this image of feminists as a 1970s bra burner, right? And as Carol said, there was no fire. It was a Liberty trash can, a couple of bras were thrown in. That's all there was. But at any rate, that reification of this image of a feminist is just false. And so I liked, Carol, your comments too, that when we get up there and just are who we are, and then, and by the way, I also happen to espouse feminism, we've broken down some stereotypes, hopefully.
That reification of feminism, though, mirrors and echoes the reification of things like being a liberal. And
Yes.
it's not, this reification just didn't occur magically. There are people in the world who are opposed to social inequality, who have somehow grasped and controlled the mechanisms by which we learn things, and have expropriated these ideas and turned them evil. And so it's not just that people will deny being feminists, but one step further, is that I'm not a feminist, but. And then they proceed to say that they're feminists. It's the label, like being a liberal. Most people in this room are probably advocates of some form of social equality, would like to alleviate poverty, would like to alleviate suffering, maybe don't believe that government is a hideous, hideous thing by definition, but they would just run away from the idea of being labeled a liberal. And so I think sometimes we think that these things happen by accident or some anonymous social forces, but they're not. They're identifiable, and they can be fought against. It's difficult, though.
There's also a converse of that too, what I like to call like a princess feminism. Folks who will embrace feminism because, then it means that I get to choose. So I get to choose to sit out around in the coffee shop and hire a nanny to take care of my children because I'm a liberated woman. Well, to me, that's just not feminism,
Or there's the
But-
commodity feminism.
The commodity feminism, that's a good one.
Which is the Sex and the City kind of feminism, which is I'm liberated, which means I get to wear Manolo Blahniks. That somehow consumerism has been tied in with feminism, particularly in the last decade or so, and has suggested that activism is no longer necessary in some regard.
Can I say something? Certainly appreciate all your comments, and I'm going to be one of the ugly feminists for you right here. Push the envelope a little bit more. What?
Princess.
Princess. All right. No, not a princess. Ugly stepmother, maybe.
No.
And by the way, my anger about stuff didn't come through feminism. It came through studies about race and coming to understand those dynamics. But my understanding initially about the different waves of feminism was to work for those who were vulnerable to social power and social structures, okay? Now, certainly, initially in late 1800s, when women were working for the vote, there was a lot of racism in that type of initiative. There's a lot of problems within much of feminism that fails to really look at, well, who counts here, okay? Who counts? And a failure to acknowledge the dynamics of race and class. So that if we just talk about ourselves, if we just think that we're outlaws, you can choose not to be an outlaw. But if you are unskilled, unemployed, female with kids, you can't choose to have a different life unless you want to give up your kids, right? You are far more vulnerable to the world, and it seems to me that feminism begins to give us those sort of greater conceptual tools to look at the ways in which we separate and divide ourselves, the way we devalue some and say, yeah, you don't really matter as much, which is what feminists were working against. Yeah, women do matter, okay? And so I would say, yes, we do the things that we do best, but we can't be self-satisfied that the way we do feminism here or activism here is enough if it's still informed by our privilege, okay, and our more self-focus, if you mean. Yeah. So I would say, look, if we have the resources here, the conceptual skills to begin to understand more of how people get dissed and seriously violated, okay? I'm going to give you an example that blew me away the other day, and it's the intersection of gender and race, okay? But we should be using our tools for that, to address and advance a world that does better than previous generations.
But my question is, the student is not going to register for the class that has the word F on it. Or maybe not even the student is not going to register for the class that has race on it.
Yeah.
And they're the student you
So
want
you
to.
put
So the
sex
people
in
that
it.
register for the courses are the ones that.
Feminism and sex.
Yeah.
That'll, like, you put that in the topic.
Like, can
people
we
come.
come up with a way of approaching teaching that allows people to enter into these issues without alienating them by the name of the course?
Yeah,
Right.
well, but I think that we've taken a little bit of a different turn with regards to how do we identify ourselves.
Yeah.
And what I was saying with regards to the issue of activism, and to me, and in keeping with sort of a Christ type of image, we have to always be mindful, who might I be leaving out? Who's most vulnerable and can't choose to opt out of something that might put them at risk? And so that we do that. The other day, there's this incredible documentary called Unnecessary Causes. And it looks at the health effects of social inequality. The health effects of social inequality. The segment that blew me away was the one that showed that black women in this country have much lower birth rate children and higher infant mortality, regardless of their economic class and resources, than anywhere else. The study went on to look and see, well, maybe it's something about black female bodies. So we'll look at that. And they said, no, as a matter of fact, black women who come from Africa and come to the United States, the birth weight of their children, infant mortality rates are the same, they're parity with whites and people elsewhere. It's their daughters, however. It's their daughters that will have babies of low birth weight, which says the conditions in which they live is so stressful and so toxic, fighting a world that says you don't matter, you don't count, you're not good enough, that even when you have lots of money, and again, this affects professional women also, that it has an effect on the body. So that type of thing, I think we should be aware of, that it's not just sort of one thing on one level, but all the different ways in which the way we organize ourselves, the institutions that we have, the policies and stuff, have dramatic effects on people, and it's like, who's most vulnerable? So I would say feminism certainly helped me to get to a different way of seeing things that in some ways radicalized me. I used to be a nice person. I was always afraid. I spent most of my teenager, are you mad at me? Are you? Now I don't give a shit. Excuse me. It's like, what I'm mad at is a world, okay, that treats people in such a way that they give birth to low birth weight.
I always wonder, for people who aren't a little bit mad at things in the world, what's wrong? Like, if anyone thinks that everything's okay, you kind of have a little bit of a, you're either living in a daze or, you're really at the top of it all.
Or you're just trying to get by. If you spend your life being unhappy and angry all the time, your mental health takes a toll as well.
Yeah,
so there's a balance.
But anger is has a positive psychological quality too, right?
Sometimes.
Yeah.
But what you said reminded me, this idea of, I look around and say, okay, well, who's being left out? And this constant sort of vigilance about, well, who's being hurt, who's being left out, what else can I do, has to be tempered with a personal care for ourselves and our families as well, so that we can be effective in what we do and we don't burn out and become useless.
Oh, people are in different contexts and make different choices, absolutely.
So,
different stages.
I would, some people can sometimes think to themselves, well, what can I be doing? I'm not doing enough. And then that there's something wrong because they're not doing enough. And I think you really do have to make choices about balance there, which in itself, balancing work and family is, again.
Oh, it's just.
I would actually, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say that the one thing that I would say that our student population, and probably our faculty population too, sometimes it's easier to embrace a model of service than it is to embrace a model of activism for all kinds of reasons. But I'm going to help people who need help instead of I'm going to change things. Helping people, that's what nice people do. That's not threatening. So, but changing things, that is threatening, and it should be really. I mean, it's going to. It would really promoting real, authentic change is kind of scary and should be kind of scary. And I think that gender and women's studies just always has to make sure that we do not forget that we have to strive to make change happen. And I think that's especially, frankly, it's an especially delicate task at a Catholic institution in many ways, because there are so many ways that, not all ways, of course, there are many ways that a Catholic institution can foster women's empowerment, but there are also some ways that some very obvious kinds of activism on behalf of women would run right against, to me, some of the things that the Catholic Church would say would be a good idea to do.
Like birth control.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So.
Well, but even if we can get back to the idea of teaching as activism, that I have to be very, extra careful and a little bit nervous, frankly, when I do my lectures on birth control, on the psychological effects of abortion. I find that to be a thing that's hard for me to talk about with my students, that my students know is hard for them to talk about. I mean, just talking about sexuality in my classes is, I guess, a political act, and definitely has the risk-taking. Every time I do it, I'm worried I'm going to lose my job.
See, if we were to do a kind of activism as a steering committee, I think our activism should be oriented towards our internal, if you could talk about should be oriented towards white men. Because I think that white men are probably the people on the campus who know the least about themselves being gendered. And I think that's dangerous for absolutely everybody else in the world. They do not see themselves as gendered. And that's a really big problem. And not only is it a problem for people who are not white men, but it's a problem for the white men themselves, because if you follow the demographics of what are happening to white men in this country, there's a serious problem. There's a serious problem. there's major declines in intelligence levels, and the burst of autism is affecting men predominantly in the country. There's a problem. There's an imbalance. And I would say feminism sometimes neglects to recognize that in order to achieve the concrete things that need to be done for women, gay, lesbian, and transgendered people, that white, straight men need to recognize themselves as gendered and raced, because they don't.
I agree.
All that's invisible to
I
them.
agree, but I shook my head when you said that, just because that's also targeting the people who, I know you make an argument that they're vulnerable. That's true, but there are women are equally vulnerable, if not more so. And so I think I would resist elevating white men, because it still, even if you make that argument, white men make more money than
They still
any
have the
other
power.
ethnic groups. They have
See,
They have
I'm talking
every
about
position of
targeting
power,
them from
essentially.
an
Look at the Senate.
But I'm talking about targeting them from an intellectual and an ideological perspective, not helping them become more successful in the world. Because when you begin to change the way somebody who is like a patriarch or a misogynist thinks, then you can begin to change
But
the
by
world that you
targeting
live in.
them, aren't I also saying you're still the center of everything?
Well, and
I
we also
mean-
have to be careful about saying that feminism is to blame that men have been ignored in any
Yeah.
way, because men actually have had the center, and in many ways are also the center of feminism, insofar as they act or misbehave or whatever, act poorly. Or act unjustly. So, but
But it can't be a binary.
I agree. No,
It can't be a
that's the
binary.
thing. And Bell Hooks
It has to be a
this
dialogue.
Bell Hooks has this wonderful essay about how feminism is a political movement to fight sexist oppression, and it's about anybody who's affected by sexist oppression, and men are affected
Absolutely.
by sexist. Images of masculinity are a result of sexist oppression.
Absolutely.
But we can't lose the sight of that it's a political movement. So, yeah.
See, I would worry about that, Dave, because that runs the risk of blowback, and that runs the risk of people saying, well, there you go, you hate men, from an intellectual standpoint. I would like to see a gender and women's studies program and gender and women's studies activists address the institutional arrangements in a place like Villanova that perpetuates a certain cultural reality and economic reality that fortifies these misconceptions of gender. And I would like to hear from maybe some of the students on what they think needs to be addressed institutionally at Villanova to help break down some of these gender inequities. I mean, something, Kate, I apologize. For instance, the importance of sports. Sorry. Just hypothetically. I'm not saying I believe this or anything. But hypothetically, the importance of sports to the institution reflects a certain masculine bias. If we believe the surveys that say men are generally more interested in sports than women are. And for different reasons, by the way. And men participate in sports and watch sports for different reasons than women do. But by putting so much institutional emphasis on sports, we are creating a certain caricature, and we're creating certain ways that people are going to tend to act. So what are the things that you all in the trenches feel are ways that Villanova perhaps perpetuates some sort of probably very subtle gender bias? Alexa?
I dance on the Wildcat Dancers dance team, and we do the women's basketball games. And every time I go to dance, there's almost nobody there in the student section. It's like empty. And if you want to get tickets to a men's game, it's impossible. You have to enter a lottery. The disparity is so huge. And I think we really saw it at Hoops Mania, where they introduced the women's team first. They talked about them, introduced all of them, everybody clapped for them. Then the women sat down, and a limo came out with Jane and the men's team. There's a limo. They're it's ridiculous.
I just want a performing arts center.
And I've had people ask me, why don't you dance at the real games? The women's games aren't real games. And it's just, I feel like Villanova, because the men's basketball team does get so much press, and, men's basketball is, in college, more of a big deal, I think, than women's basketball.
It's all
they
about
put
money.
so much emphasis on the men's team that the women's team just gets completely shunted to the side. I mean, to the fact that there's, they have to, beg people to go to
Really? That's what happens?
Yeah, you get extra credit for going to women's games than like Banker's Liquor Lottery.
It's depressing. Other students?
You had it. Hand up over here.
Oh, I was going to say about the extra credit, that in order, like, in order to go to the men's games, like, you need extra.
Yeah.
I sort of have a question. I think, everyone's bringing up the whole idea that, we have this idea of what feminism is, obviously it's very inaccurate. And I guess for me, I think it was my sophomore year when I first took the general studies class, and I was like, I'm a feminist. And so for me, I take that label now, and I do say that I am one, but when I talk with my girlfriends and like we talk about gender issues, whatever, and then they always preface it with, oh no, I'm not a feminist. I'm like, how, we're talking about like, your roles as professors and instructors and not all the big instructors in academia, but in life. But as like a student, like how do I approach that like as a peer, as a friend, without sounding preachy or like, why are you telling me this? Like you don't have any authority in this matter. Do you know what I mean? Like how do you start the conversation without making it seem like, oh, well, I know more than you? I think for me, I struggle with that because obviously I learn a lot. I might need to do those classes, but I don't want it to be like, you're a feminist. I don't know how to approach that conversation.
Why not ask them,
Ask.
what's the problem with it? Like, say to them, why do you say you're not a feminist?
Yeah, why don't you want to be called a feminist?
Is there something wrong with it? Not to interrogate them, but to ask them to ask themselves that question. And I think, I suspect that there are a lot of people, I know I find this in my class, my first day, we talk about what is a feminist, and everybody kind of, does their coming out and realizes, oh my gosh. But I think for a lot of people, there's this intuitive feminism that is, stems just from a belief in equality and equity. But the label is something separate, and just getting them to be aware that you identify as a feminist might make it easier, and say, I guess I'm not going to be the only one. And give it time also, because it's a maturity thing too, to be comfortable in your skin. And
Well, that's what I was going to say too. Another approach, in addition to just sort of saying how come you're not, is to say, oh sure you are. You just don't have the confidence yet. To act like it's a cool club, it is, right? And just say, sure you are. You just be proud. Just get the confidence, be brave enough, and you'll embrace it too. So almost assume, yes, you are a feminist. And I think people who work for justice, who speak on behalf of the vulnerable or act on behalf of the vulnerable, are feminists on some level.
Though, this is where I kind of really do. I really come to head with those issues, because this is like, what if I stand up and say I'm a feminist? What if I stand, and I do stand up and say I'm a feminist, and the things that I say about my interest in men are based on the fact that my intellectual life began in an interest in feminist issues. And those issues grew out of the issues that I focused on now. But within the academy, I'm sorry, you might disagree with me, but first of all, like it makes you bristle when I say what I say, and then when I go to conferences and I try to present on women's studies panels or feminist panels, you can hardly break in. It's hard to like get your foot in the door, and when you get your foot in the door, you're kind of like, maybe it's just theater, I don't know, but I sit there like, okay, they're not going to attack me, and this is going to be okay. And inevitably it turns to be like, but you're a man and you're white. And I'm like, okay, so we're going to go to that level of it.
But are they, or are you just, are you seeing what you anticipate from feminists? I mean, I think there's no doubt that there's, in every conference I've been to, there's an inner circle, and you've got to sort of break into that inner circle. So if you're going to feminist conferences in theater, then that conference probably, I don't know, but started with a group of women in academic who probably had been injured and harmed in various
and excluded from every other
traumatic ways. Yes.
But this is a feminist principle. What that assumes is that men are not injured and harmed by patriarchy and
not in the same way.
Not in the same way.
Well, no, but not all women are affected by it in the same way.
True.
It's got to be a broad-based concern, or else it will become polarized to the point where people say, well, you're not included in that. you're not part of that. And I think that that was an important wave of feminism, but I don't know that that's like where feminism is now.
Elise has her hand up.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think that's maybe a deficiency on Villanova's campus. And I think that kind of in this third wave movement that's going on now is not the movement that's happening in Villanova. And I think a lot of it has to do with our, students are very concerned globally, but they don't care what's going on locally because the issues aren't happening to them. They're very cut off from that. They're very, this is not a concern to me. I'm privileged. I don't, that's not, I'm willing to give my time and energy and do hard work and like you're saying, be a nice person to help other people in Cambodia and in India, but the awareness isn't heightened on campus that patriarchy is a problem and that all of those things are a problem to men, women, the whole spectrum of genders. And I think that's a deficiency on Villanova's campus that perpetuates something that we can't get past. And I think that's maybe a piece of activism that needs to happen on this campus with this group of people that is maybe happening in the world that hasn't happened here yet.
I agree.
And I think that would answer maybe a lot of the questions.
Totally, we're talking about how we're so service oriented, we focus so much on the other that we don't even worry about dealing with us and our personal interactions. And also we need to work with that first.
What strikes me, this belief that patriarchy isn't affecting people at Villanova on campus. I always talk about, in my psychology of women class, we talk a lot about eating disorders because it's an important piece of that discipline. And we come back to this idea of like consciousness raising and demystification. And I look around the room and I know lots of my students have these problems, but they don't see how they are connected to that patriarchy. They don't look around campus and say, you know what? It's not an accident that we don't have a whole lot of overweight people on this campus. It's not an accident that we all look the same. And where that fits into the big picture and to the political context is something that I think we need to do a better job of addressing and making everyone see how real and how political their experiences are and how pertinent feminism is to their lives. That it's not just about helping women in inner city Philadelphia or whatever, but here we need it.
And that's why I think that it's important. And it's the hardest thing. And the people coming to the gender women's studies office, me being 2 years older than them, it's a hard thing to do too. And it's important on a peer-to-peer level to, like, how do you deal with that? I'm a feminist, but you're not, even though we actually think a lot of the same things. But it's important to be somebody of the same age group saying, we're not the same as our mothers, even though we've learned a lot from them and we've grown a lot from that. But that's the only way that we're going to actually affect that kind of change and show them that eating disorders are a feminist issue and it's happening on campus and it's because of these things. And we have to do that as students because they're not going to take it from our professors and make the connection without 17 steps in the middle. And that's why it's important.
So what should we do to make that happen?
We should let people go.
17 steps.
Yes.
We need a 17-step program.
Weren't we supposed to end at 3:30?
70 minutes?
Oh, I thought we were supposed to. When are we supposed to be done? 3:30. I thought it was 3:30.
Oh, we were told 70 minutes.
I wonder
We
if
can
related to it
go.
though, is David, your being able to tell students that you're a feminist. Now, coming from female faculty is one thing, coming from male faculty, especially a male faculty member who's a priest. It carries a different weight, and I think as a role model to male students particularly, it's critical that more male faculty get on board.
Yeah, I mean, at least for me, that's what I talk about when I'm in the church. It's what I talk about. It's just not always explicit. It's not always with a placard in my hand. And it pisses people off. People get pissed off at me after Mass, because I'm like, you're supposed to love people. What about Mexicans? Them too. Anyway, I think we're about at the end. Are there any final comments? I don't know that we've reached any conclusions, but I certainly think that, at least from my perspective, this is a really important type of thing, and I think it was a great conversation. I'd like to thank
Thank you all for coming.